To order, we'll take up the following items for approval. Action item 1A is the approval of the minutes, November 14th, 2022 meeting. I'd like to move the approval of action item 1A. Do I have a second? Any discussion on the item? All right, we'll now vote. All of those in favor? Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? That item's approved. Let me now address the policy calendar. Policy item 1B, or is that 1B1?
Yeah.
1B1 is a resolution to approve the fiscal year 2024 City of New York's, City University of New York's investment portfolio spending rate. To ensure compliance with the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, the university must analyze the investment portfolio to determine the appropriate spending rate for the upcoming fiscal year. For FY '24, the university proposes a 4% spending rate, which is the same rate as fiscal year '23. Let me ask Interim Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer Christina Chiappa to introduce the topic before handing off to Thomas Zhao, the University Executive Treasurer, for a brief presentation.
Thank you so much. So just briefly, this is an annual activity that the board needs to do. We're actually doing this a bit earlier than last year, just so the colleges know much earlier what they have to spend of the endowment. So we actually are moving this up at least one meeting. So I'm just going to hand it over to Thomas in interest of time to kind of go through a few slides that we have on this area.
Absolutely. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the board and of the Chancery. So again, as Christine mentioned, we're here for the CUNY spending deliberation, which per NMIFRA, the board has to make the decision on spending. Just briefly, NMIFRA, the 8 prudence factor, which many of you have heard before. And there's 3 aspects to NMIFRA, but the ones that we're here to talk about is the standard governing the endowment fund. Unlike the Magic 8 Ball, the board obviously is making this decision based on looking at the 8 prudence factor, and is doing this in a way that is under the NMIFRA, allows us to group similar situated funds. Instead of going to each fund by fund, the NMIFRA allows us to group similar situated funds so we can make one spending decision for all the similarly grouped funds. The 8 prudence factor, preserving the endowment, the purpose of the endowment, and in general, the economic conditions that we are in right now. Obviously, inflation is a big concern currently, and the total return and appreciation, we are going to show you in the next few slides how we have maintained some surpluses as a result of past underspending as well as past income. And other resource of CUNY, alternative to spending from the endowment, and our policy, which requires the board to make the decision on spending. So before we get into the spending, certainly we look at NACUMBO and looking at how our peers, what they're doing, and a couple of key things that came out of the NACUMBO endowment study. So interesting enough, total spending increase, despite in 22, it was one of the top 7 worst years in investment in the S&P 500. What we saw from NACUMBO and was that spending actually went up even though the rates went down. The reason was because the year before, most of the major endowment had double-digit gains. Because of the double-digit gain, even though the percentage dropped, the total amount spent was actually went up. And that also explained why the withdrawal was a higher amount, but the rate is lower. And the overall, what the NACUMBO endowment study showed that overall there was a big emphasis on student financial aid, along with most of major emergency grants for students. Many colleges used their resources to help students during the last couple of years. But there's a dichotomy in terms of big and small endowment. Per the NACUMBO endowment study, the smaller endowment actually had worse losses And part of it is because they don't necessarily have access to private equity, in many cases, to be able to weather some of the storms. Many of them still are very much, equity, 60%, 40% fixed income. And as we saw, both fixed income and private equity went down, equities went down in 22. So there was actually nowhere to hide. So many of the larger endowment, on the other hand, did a lot better because they were able to kind of diversify and went into private equity, among other things, to weather the storm much better. Returns drop, but, and this is the big but, was that the first half of the year in 22, the returns were great. It was only really the second half that returns really started to slump. So that's why a lot of the colleges also was able to raise a lot of money, because typically the cycle for raising money is November. The Giving Tuesday, among other kind of fundraising activities. So a lot of the folks were getting too close to the end of the year, and they were donating in order to kind of capture some of those gains for tax purposes. So there was a great deal of donation in the first half of 22, but the second half there was a downturn in the market. So the CUNY historical returns and spending, what you see here is what our returns were over the last few years, as well as what the key thing here is that the rate that the board approved is a lot more than what the college is actually spending. And when we look at the difference between what we have returns, allows us the buffer. That surplus allows us to weather the storm. The CUNY long-term investment pool is built for the long term. We do have ups and downs of the market, but that's okay because we have unspent surpluses, as well as, the strategy, the risk and return strategy is really built upon being able to afford the colleges to be able to maintain that spending level.
Quick question.
Yeah.
If you look at 22, so while there was an approved spending rate of 4%, we spent 2.75%.
Yes.
Is it adjustments made during the year? What in fact triggered the, I will say, underspend from the projection at least?
So we gave the colleges a budget of spending up to 4%.
Right.
Not every single college spent. Some colleges were able to use other resources in order to provide funding for what they needed to do. So not every single college spent from the endowment. And in many cases, that's what we saw over the last few years as well. Colleges were tightening up a little bit. And also, even though the 2.75%, similar to Nakumbo, is a smaller percent, but because 21 was a banter year, right, it's a bigger amount.
Yeah.
Right? So similarly, when we get down to this, the math, just because 21 was a great year, the amount was, even though the colleges spent a small percent, it's still okay because a greater amount went to the students.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I'm puzzled about this. And I'll tell you my look at it, I kind of look at it as if it's my money and I'm trying to take care of my grandmother or something, or my children. Our 10-year return is 5.8% overall. Our 5-year return is 4.7%. Are we basically saying that we could distribute 4% a year? And then the long-term growth and sustainability of our funds come from the 0.73 or 1.8 that's left over? It just doesn't look to me like 4% is the number that I would say something more like 3%, but then, I don't know, maybe there's something magical about, 0.5% or 1% net of what we take out over. It seems to me we need to leave a little bit more in and take a little bit less out. And so I would think that something more like 3%, realizing that we actually distribute 2.6 and 2.8 and 1.4, it wouldn't reduce what we're doing, but I just don't think 4% is sustainable based upon any evidence that's actually in front of us.
The only thing, because the question would have to go along with it, there have to be contributions also. So are there any additional, other than just revenue, or other than just, what you're receiving from investments, is there additional contributions to the fund?
There are additional contributions to the fund.
That's the other thing.
And, you asked an interesting question, that's looking at the past, right? One of the things that we always say in investment is past performance does not necessarily predict future outcome. Makita is gonna go over later, some of the numbers where some of the changes in terms of investment, where they see long-term, right? 20 years, long-term, what is the return on average that we're gonna get? And based on those long-term projections, that's where we are making our recommendation. And also, even though we're staying at 4% for the recommended spending rate, the total amount is actually lower.
Yeah.
The reason that is lower is because in '22, there was a reduction in terms of returns. That reduction in returns, while the percentage is the same, the total amount that we're giving to is less. And one of the other factors also is that unlike other colleges and university, CUNY Endowment spends a predominantly more percentage on in supporting our students. So when we look at the NACOMBO endowment study for endowments about our size and look at what their spending is on, the spending for CUNY is a lot more for scholarships and a lot more
Why would
for our
that-
students.
If we're spending it, I agree, it's wonderful to spend it on students, but what does that have to do with a sustainable rate? Your
Sure.
answer to me, I think, is that we're gonna look to the future and things are gonna be a lot better in the future than they've been in the past. And I'm inclined to wait a little bit into the future and see if this happens, but as a fiduciary, I can't support 4% based upon what I can see. I could support 3%.
But I think, Ned, a couple things, if you allow me. So 2022 was the 7th worst year in S&P since 1926, right? So it was obviously a very unique year. But if you look at our returns before that, right, we were pretty steady. We had 7%, 9.4. We took a little dip in 20. We had this huge
Our 10-year
thing.
rate was 5.8 on the average.
But if you look at it, yeah, and so, but we had rates before that, right? So we had these accumulated surpluses. So a couple things, we had these accumulated surpluses. The 4% spending will be less already because it factors in historical ups and downs already. And also if the board feels that as the year goes on, if we feel that that is not a correct percentage, there's a responsibility and we can always go back and change it. But we feel that the colleges rely and the students are relying on these funds for scholarships. It continues to be a hard time that students are had, and so we want to be able to give them a steady stream to be able to give to the students.
But we wouldn't be reducing what we really do. We would just be more realistic about a cap that we don't actually distribute anyway. But if it's the will of the board to do this, I wouldn't want to screw anything up, but I'm just saying that based upon my experience in investment, and I have some,
Yeah.
I wouldn't come to the conclusion of 4%, I would be closer to 3%. And my argument is that, first of all, that it isn't reducing anything we're doing for anybody, and second of all, it's consistent with a 5.8% return over 10 years. And, my crystal ball about the future is a little bit cloudy. And I think I would wait a while before I bet on the future.
Yeah.
But this is my view. If I can abstain and it's still, you get to do what you want, I don't want to rock the boat, but I will say that this isn't my first rodeo and I can't see this one.
I want to say one more thing about the 2.75%. That's an aggregate number. So there are many, many funds in the investment pool, right? There is unrestricted funds, the restricted funds, there's endowment funds, and there's old funds, right? And there's new funds. So the 2.75 is the average of everything. There are some scholarship funds that are very active, always spend whatever percentage that we give them, while there are others that wouldn't for some reason, right? So if it's unrestricted, maybe they don't need to. There's also old funds in the pool, right, that are sometimes harder to spend. So there varies of the spending. So the 2.75 is an aggregate, but it doesn't mean that there are lots of funds who actually spend the full 4%.
I don't want, I mean, again, I'm not, I wouldn't debate, I mean, there's a comfort level in your take, right, in terms of, but reducing the percent does mean that there's less money available to support whatever causes those funds provide. I just wanna make sure that that's,
Well, not less than we spend, and furthermore, if we're overly optimistic about our expenditure rate, we're diminishing the available funds in the future because we're bad managers of our investments.
well, not that, I mean,
But
all
I'll,
I'm saying is, you said that if we do the 3%, nothing gets affected and we don't do less. And I just wanted to point out that we will be doing less if that's the case. That doesn't take away some of the other things that you made, but there's less money available to
yeah,
support.
there's less possible money, yes, I agree.
Everybody has a different comfort level.
Yeah.
Okay, as long as we're not violating the rules of gravity.
And this is just a chart showing in terms of what was our spend on scholarships, and, you know, even at this, keeping it the same percentage, you know, is a smaller amount, for this year. Obviously, a lot of questions about inflation, you know, certain returns. We are seeing some stabilization in returns in both January and February. We are seeing, some of our returns in the positive territory for the year, so, that also reinforces the comfort level that we have, that this is really a long-term pool. It's not really, you know, we don't react to market changes over the short term. So that's why we, you know, went with our recommendation of 4%. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Questions and/or comments? Understand that we may not all be on the same page, but then again, we do have a recommendation that's been made for 4%. So let me, and that is item, I guess, 1B1. Let me move the item. So I'm gonna move the item as recommended by staff. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
All right, now a discussion on this, and I understand, you know, Professor, that you're opposed to this. Any other discussion on the item?
Well, this can be revised.
As the
Next
year goes
year.
along. But also, you can also revise it as, I mean, as your year proceeds. You
Right.
can, if you have a incredible drop, you can revise it mid-year, so. I'm gonna, if any other discussion, I'm gonna move the item. So all of those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Got one. Any other opposed or abstentions? None? That item's approved. With no more items on the policy calendar, we'll now move to information items. To discuss the information item on today's agenda, we'll go into executive session in accordance with Section 105H of the New York State Open Meetings Law. I make a motion to move into executive session. Do I have a second? Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? We are in executive session.